My mom talks about the fights that she had with
Your
Meri
mom
here and
talking
there.
the fight? Your mom talking with the fight?
The financial records had just been released, and they painted a picture that was absolutely wild. But even those shocking numbers weren't the biggest bombshell lurking beneath the surface of Christine Brown's carefully constructed world. Mykelti had just pulled back the curtain on something that made all those sister-wife tensions look like nothing more than a genteel tea party. What she revealed about the explosive confrontations between her mother and Meri Brown would forever change how anyone could see everything that had unfolded within those shared houses. The scene that was about to unfold was one of pure intensity. Inside the Leahy house, one of Christine's children came running to their mother, tears streaming down their face. These weren't just ordinary upset tears, but the kind of complete devastation that only comes from being verbally demolished by an adult who should have been their protector instead.
But Meri, she was a little bit too verbally harsh on one of my siblings, and it was bad. That sibling ended up crying a ton, and they were really sad, and they were really hurt, and they went and told my mom about it.
This child had just been on the receiving end of what Mykelti describes as Meri being a little bit too verbally harsh. And that was putting it incredibly mildly, considering the level of trauma this kid was displaying. Christine's mama bear instincts erupted immediately. There was no hesitation, no diplomatic sister-wife discussion, no waiting around for Cody to step in and handle the situation. She marched straight upstairs into Meri's apartment and confronted her face-to-face, woman to woman. This wasn't their first rodeo either. According to Mykelti, this marked the second major "don't talk to my kids again" showdown between these two women. And the tension had been steadily building for years, like pressure in a volcano. But here's what made this revelation so utterly shocking. This wasn't just about one terrible day or a simple misunderstanding between two stressed-out mothers trying to navigate impossible circumstances. Mykelti describes feeling genuine relief when her mom finally stood up to Meri, saying she was very grateful because it lessened the struggle and backlash she'd been experiencing all along.
And it was in the Lehigh house, and so my mom walked straight upstairs into Meri's apartment, confronted Meri, and that was like the second time that Meri and my mom had a big, like, don't talk to my kids again kind of thing, which I was very grateful for.
Think about that for a moment. A child was so worn down by ongoing conflict that she celebrated her mother having to storm into another adult's living space to protect her. The phrase, "finally make something happen," tells you everything about how long this had been brewing beneath the surface. This wasn't reactive parenting or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was the culmination of a pattern that had been slowly damaging children and forcing mothers into impossible positions where they had to choose between keeping peace and protecting their babies. What Mykelti reveals next is even more disturbing. She admits she remembers far more fights and arguments than her mother discusses in the book, suggesting Christine may have actually downplayed the extent of these conflicts for the world to see.
Because it kind of lessened a lot of the struggle and strife that I was feeling, the backlash that I was feeling. So I was like, yes, finally, make something happen, take her away.
When a child retains sharper recollections of family dysfunction than the parent who penned an entire memoir about their experience, that reveals something profound about how persistent and intense these clashes truly were. The most unsettling aspect: Mykelti explicitly states her reluctance to dive into the wildest specifics because she remains uncertain whether all individuals involved would approve of the complete story being exposed. What sort of exchanges between grown-ups and youngsters demand that degree of careful handling and secrecy? What transpired within those walls that continues to be too delicate to address publicly even years afterward, when everyone has broken free from the arrangement? This upstairs showdown moment symbolizes something far more significant than two women clashing over child-rearing approaches. It's a glimpse into a poisonous household framework, where kids became collateral damage in grown-up authority battles, where mothers had to physically battle to shield their own children within their alleged family structure, and where the emotional wounds ran so deep that adult children still bear scars they're just starting to process. The pressing issue isn't whether Christine and Meri possessed contrasting mothering philosophies. The pressing issue is how many additional confrontations like this occurred away from prying eyes, and how many youngsters got trapped in the warfare of an arrangement that was never constructed to genuinely safeguard anyone's welfare. And that's when circumstances became even more complicated. Because this upstairs clash wasn't some standalone episode that Christine could dismiss as an off day, Mykelti unleashes another revelation that entirely transforms how anyone might comprehend the Brown household interactions. She discloses that she was repeatedly targeted as the focus of Meri's fury, characterizing herself as perpetually somewhat distinct from her other brothers and sisters, and confessing she absorbed much of Meri's anger and hostility. But here's where the narrative shifts into more troubling territory. Meri didn't restrict her severe treatment to a single child.
Other spot. Came to you. I like the spot I was in.
You don't get it.
Why not?
Because there's that spot there.
That's my spot.
Mykelti makes it crystal clear that Meri didn't always pick favorites, and evidently unleashed her frustrations on other brothers and sisters as well. So, this wasn't about personality conflicts or one challenging relationship. This was about a methodical pattern where numerous children endured treatment harsh enough that decades afterward, they're still working through the emotional damage. Consider what it signifies for a child to recognize themselves as absorbing the bulk of an adult's rage. Mykelti grasped even as a youngster that she was shouldering an unfair portion of emotional mistreatment from someone who was meant to serve as a parental figure. She identified the cycle, embraced it as her normal existence, and mastered surviving in a household where she understood she was the main target. The details of why Mykelti felt like an outsider add another dimension to this narrative. She characterizes herself as more artistic, more defiant, someone who challenged cult regulations and desired to dress in less conservative clothing. In essence, she was displaying evidence of independent reasoning and personal identity in a framework engineered to eliminate both. But here's the reality that every woman who's guided a teenager understands. Wanting to experiment with different outfits and testing limits represents completely typical adolescent development. What makes this troubling is how Mykelti's natural evolution into her own individual seemingly provoked such severe reactions from Meri.
That's my spot.
Peyton picks on the girls sometimes, which, I don't know. One side I'm kind of like, oh, that means they're integrating really well because he's treating them like sisters. And that's horrible.
This was about a child facing consequences for imagination, for possessing viewpoints, for seeking some authority over her own look. These weren't personality defects needing fixing. These were indicators of a thriving young person discovering her identity. The cycle becomes even more obvious when you understand that Christine's other daughters were also exploring similar limits. Mykelti mentions that Maddie also desired to wear shorter skirts, but somehow Mykelti absorbed the majority of the negative response for the standard teenage conduct. That indicates the problem wasn't genuinely about modesty guidelines or proper attire. The problem was about dominance, authority, and one adult repeatedly singling out one particular child. But the most telling detail emerges when Mykelti discusses how thankful she felt when Christine finally stood up to Meri. She describes the comfort of having the conflict and tension and retaliation diminished. Those are not phrases a child should ever need to use when describing their everyday home atmosphere. Conflict, tension, and retaliation shouldn't be fixtures in a kid's existence, particularly not from grown-ups who are meant to be supplying protection and consistency.
Brianna comes up to me and she's screaming at the top of her lungs. She goes, Peyton hit me in the eye. So we've had some problems with Peyton and Garrison picking on the little kids.
When Mykelti says she recalls far more battles than her mother covers in Christine's book, she's revealing that what Christine disclosed was actually the cleaned-up version, the surface of something much deeper. The clashes that were so intense, even Christine couldn't overlook them. While countless other episodes were accepted as normal, downplayed, or erased by the grown-ups who should have been safeguarding these children, this wasn't about contrasting child-rearing approaches or household coordination disputes. This was about children adapting to expect emotional brutality as part of their everyday existence, and one child specifically learning that she would perpetually serve as the target for an adult's unprocessed rage and resentment.
Kids have been doing this way too long, way too much, and something needed to be said now. Guys, these are your brothers and sisters whether you like it or not, and you better start treating them like it.
Now, here's where the genuine dysfunction exposes itself. Because when you examine the actual child-rearing beliefs fueling these explosive clashes, you uncover two women functioning from entirely different worlds about what childhood should resemble. And trapped in between were kids who never understood which regulations mattered or which grown-up might explode at them next. Christine portrays herself in the book as the type of mother who believes children need to be children. She was comfortable with youngsters bouncing on mattresses, exploring cabinets, playing with storage containers, creating noise, and generally acting like, well, kids. Her approach focused on allowing children to discover, make disorder, and develop through organic play. For any parent who's ever permitted their toddler to empty a kitchen drawer to clang on cookware, this method sounds completely sensible. Meri, conversely, wanted her residence maintained in a particular manner. She didn't tolerate boisterous conduct. She held firm expectations about sound levels and tidiness, and she believed in instant discipline when those benchmarks weren't achieved. For any parent who's ever felt stressed by disorder or required some structure in their living space, this method also sounds reasonable. But here's where this sister-wife arrangement transformed potentially typical parenting contrasts into a psychological battlefield for the children. These weren't two distinct homes with separate guidelines. These were conflicting authorities beneath the same ceiling, and kids were receiving contradictory signals that positioned them for perpetual failure and bewilderment. Imagine being 8 years old and engaging in something that's completely fine with one mother, but entirely wrong to the other.
There were many other incidents growing up where I was not treated kindly by Meri.
These children weren't just dealing with standard childhood boundary testing, they were navigating contradictory grown-up expectations, where success with one parental figure automatically meant conflict with another. That wasn't a family structure. That was a setup for perpetual anxiety and learned helplessness. The Tupperware example perfectly illustrates how innocent childhood behavior became ammunition in adult power struggles. Christine saw a child exploring textures, sounds, and spatial relationships through play. Meri saw destruction of household order and disrespect for property boundaries. Both perspectives had validity in isolation, but when they were forced into the same space with the same children, they created impossible situations. What makes this even more tragic is how the children learned to read these competing expectations and adjust their behavior based on which adult was present. Mykelti describes being different and receiving the brunt of Meri's wrath, but what if she was just being a normal kid who happened to align more naturally with Christine's relaxed parenting style? What if her so-called behavioral problems were actually just her inability to code switch between two completely different sets of adult expectations? The financial reality made this household divide even more devastating. Christine couldn't remove her children from Meri's influence because they literally couldn't afford separate housing. They were trapped in close quarters with incompatible approaches to child rearing, and the children paid the price for adult decisions they had no control over. But the most insidious part of this dynamic was how it taught children that their natural behavior was inherently problematic. When jumping on a bed gets you praise from one mother and punishment from another, you don't learn about boundaries or respect. You learn that your instincts can't be trusted, that adults are unpredictable, and that safety depends on perfectly reading the mood and expectations of whoever happens to be in charge at any given moment. This wasn't about cleanliness versus messiness or structure versus freedom. This was about children learning that their very existence was a source of conflict between the adults responsible for their well-being, and that no matter how they behaved, they were going to disappoint someone who had power over their daily lives. But the real bombshell hiding in this family's dysfunction wasn't just about different household rules or philosophical disagreements. It was about actual violence between children that the adults couldn't agree on how to handle. And what that reveals about these parenting clashes will make your blood boil. Let's talk about Peyton because his behavior patterns expose exactly how these adult conflicts trickled down and created dangerous situations for the younger, more vulnerable children in the family. This wasn't typical sibling rivalry or playful roughhousing. This was a pattern of targeted aggression that multiple sources have described as genuine bullying and physical abuse. The camping trip incident stands out as particularly disturbing. Peyton and other older boys were bothering Brianna, who was several years younger and completely unable to defend herself against children twice her size. According to witnesses, one of the boys actually poked Brianna in the eye during the systematic harassment. Picture that scene for a moment. A small girl being physically assaulted by older male children, while adults watched, and then those same adults arguing about whether intervention was appropriate. Meri stepped in and told the boys to knock it off because in her world, physical violence against smaller children was never acceptable regardless of family dynamics or filming schedules. But Christine got furious with Meri for addressing the situation, claiming it wasn't the right time or place for discipline. Think about that logic. A child is being physically hurt, and the concern becomes about proper protocol rather than immediate protection. This pattern repeated itself over and over. There's another documented incident where Peyton was clearly picking on younger girls, and Christine's response was essentially to normalize the behavior by saying that means they're integrating really well because he's treating them like sisters. But treating sisters like punching bags and targets for physical aggression isn't integration. It's abuse being rebranded as family bonding. The most revealing footage shows Brianna running to adults screaming about Peyton hurting her eye, while visibly distressed and in pain. This wasn't rough play that went too far. This was deliberate violence against a much smaller child. And instead of immediate consequences for the aggressor, the adults launched into arguments about whose authority took precedence and whether intervention was warranted. What makes this even more disturbing is how Gwendolyn, Peyton's own sister, has publicly described him as the most abusive in the family and refuses to have contact with him because of how physical he became with her. When your own sibling cuts you off completely due to your violent behavior, that suggests a pattern far more serious than typical brother-sister conflicts. But here's where the real dysfunction shows itself. Christine's permissive approach meant that Peyton's aggressive behavior was consistently excused, minimized, or reframed as normal male development. The classic boys will be boys mentality that teaches children that physical intimidation is acceptable if you're bigger and stronger. Meanwhile, his victims were expected to just endure the abuse, because addressing it might create conflict between the competing parental authorities. Meri found herself in the impossible position of watching violence unfold and having to choose between protecting vulnerable children or maintaining peace with Christine. When she chose protection, she was accused of overstepping boundaries. When she stayed silent, the abuse continued. Either choice resulted in criticism and conflict, while the actual perpetrator faced minimal consequences. This wasn't about different comfort levels with roughhousing or varying tolerance for childhood energy. This was about one adult consistently failing to protect children from documented physical violence, while another adult was demonized for trying to intervene. And the children caught in this dynamic learned that their safety was less important than adult politics, and that seeking help might actually make their situation worse. The long-term psychological impact of this pattern can't be overstated. Victims learned that adults wouldn't reliably protect them. Perpetrators learned that violence had minimal consequences. And everyone learned that family loyalty meant staying silent about abuse rather than addressing it directly. And that's when the story takes its darkest turn. Because what Mykelti revealed on her Patreon about the long-term psychological damage from these household conflicts will absolutely shatter your heart. This isn't just about parenting disagreements anymore. This is about a young woman in her 20s still processing childhood trauma so severe that she describes having suppressed memories from entire periods of her life. Let's be crystal clear about what Mykelti is actually saying here, because the language she uses tells you everything about the severity of what happened in those houses. She specifically states that living with Meri caused her to develop suppressed memories as a coping mechanism. That's not typical childhood forgetfulness or selective memory. That's a documented psychological response to trauma, where the brain literally blocks out experiences that are too overwhelming to process normally. The candy store money incident that sparked one major confrontation wasn't an isolated event in Mykelti's experience. She makes it painfully clear that there were many other incidents growing up where she was not treated kindly by Meri. Very, very many. The repetition in her voice, the emphasis on very, very many, suggests a pattern of mistreatment so consistent that it became the baseline of her childhood experience with this adult. But here's what makes this testimony so devastating. Mykelti describes telling her mother, "We're done," and declaring she didn't want anything to do with Meri after years of accumulated incidents. This wasn't a teenager having a dramatic moment. This was a young person recognizing an abusive pattern and trying to establish boundaries for her own psychological survival. She understood even as a child that continued exposure to Meri's treatment was damaging her mental health. The most heartbreaking part, even after Mykelti explicitly told her mother she was done with Meri and didn't want her around, it was still years where Meri would still be very present in their lives. Think about what that means for a child's sense of agency and protection. She identified the problem. She asked for help. She clearly communicated her needs, and she was still forced into ongoing contact because of the family structure and financial constraints. Mykelti's description of the houses as places where she suppressed more memories because of trauma reveals something crucial about how these living situations affected her developing brain. She wasn't just dealing with occasional conflicts or strict discipline. She was existing in a state of chronic psychological stress, severe enough that her mind had to develop protective mechanisms to function on a daily basis. When someone describes their childhood home using words like trauma, honestly, that's like what it was. They're not being dramatic or seeking attention. They're giving you clinical language that describes genuine psychological injury. Mykelti is telling us that her developmental years were shaped by an environment so harmful that decades later, She's still working to recover memories her brain deemed too dangerous to retain. The compounding effect she describes is particularly crucial to understand. It wasn't one terrible incident that created lasting damage. It was the accumulation of multiple occurrences over years that gradually wore down a child's ability to cope. Each incident built on the previous ones until the psychological load became unbearable, and her young brain started shutting down memory formation as a survival strategy. But perhaps the most damning detail is how Mykelti describes years of being trapped in proximity to someone she had identified as harmful to her well-being. Even after she found the courage to speak up, even after she clearly communicated her boundaries, the system prioritized adult relationships and religious obligations over a child's documented psychological safety. This isn't about strict parenting or high expectations. This is about a young woman still working to recover from childhood trauma that was severe enough to alter her brain's normal memory formation processes. And she's sharing this story not for attention or sympathy, but because she's finally in a place where she can begin processing experiences that were too overwhelming to fully remember when they happened. Now, here's where the story reveals its most insidious layer. Because Christine knew exactly what was happening to her children. She desperately wanted to protect them, and she was absolutely powerless to remove them from harm's way. What trapped this family in cycles of abuse wasn't just bad personalities or incompatible parenting styles. It was a systematic web of financial dependency and religious manipulation that made escape literally impossible. Christine openly admits in her book that she didn't want Meri around her kids. She recognized the damage being done, she saw the trauma accumulating, and she fought those explosive battles specifically to create some buffer between Meri and her children. But here's the devastating reality that every woman who's ever felt trapped by circumstances will recognize. Wanting to protect your kids and having the power to actually do it are two completely different things. The financial stranglehold was absolute. Christine describes working multiple side jobs just to keep food on the table. But according to Mykelti, they were living in extreme poverty, where they didn't always know where their next meal was going to come from. Some of the children didn't even have their own beds. When you're struggling to provide basic necessities like food and sleeping arrangements, the luxury of choosing your living situation simply doesn't exist. Think about the psychological torture of watching your children suffer daily harm from someone you can't avoid or exclude from their lives. Christine had to wake up every morning, knowing that her kids would be subjected to treatment that was damaging their developing minds. And she had no realistic option to change the situation. That's not parenting. That's being held hostage by poverty while watching your babies pay the price. The religious programming made this financial trap even more devastating. Christine was brainwashed to believe that staying in this toxic situation was actually virtuous, that enduring the suffering was proof of her spiritual commitment, and that Cody represented her path to eternal salvation. The cult messaging told her that protecting her children from abuse was less important than maintaining her celestial marriage. But here's what makes this situation particularly cruel. Christine did try to fight back. She had those explosive confrontations with Meri. She established boundaries where she could, and she repeatedly advocated for her children within the constraints of the system. She wasn't passively allowing abuse to continue. She was doing everything within her extremely limited power to minimize the damage while trapped in circumstances she couldn't escape. The housing arrangements reveal just how impossible their situation truly was. They lived with Meri in West Jordan, then in Lehi, then various other configurations where proximity was unavoidable. Every time Christine thought she might get some distance for her children's safety, the financial reality forced them back into shared spaces where the conflicts and trauma continued accumulating. Mykelti's description of years passing where Meri would still be very present in their lives, even after trauma was clearly identified, shows how the system worked against child protection. It didn't matter that damage was documented, boundaries were requested, and harm was ongoing. The adult obligations and financial constraints took precedence over children's psychological safety every single time. The most heartbreaking aspect is how Christine's protective instincts were systematically undermined by forces beyond her control. She fought for her kids when she could. She absorbed massive amounts of conflict to shield them when possible. And she endured years of explosive arguments specifically to minimize their exposure to harm. But the system was designed to make successful protection impossible while making mothers feel responsible for their failure to achieve it. What Christine experienced is what countless women in abusive systems understand. You can see the danger clearly. You can want desperately to protect your children. You can fight battles every single day, and still be trapped by circumstances that make escape feel impossible. The tragedy isn't that she didn't want to save her kids. The tragedy is that she was systematically prevented from doing so by a web of financial and religious control designed to keep families locked in destructive patterns. But here's where this story gets even more complicated. Because when you step back and look at the bigger picture, you realize that Meri was also trapped in an impossible situation that would have driven any rational person to the breaking point. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior toward children, but it does reveal how the polygamous system was designed to create conflict and trauma for everyone involved, including the adults. Picture being in Meri's position for a moment and try to understand the psychological pressure cooker she was existing in daily. She's dealing with infertility while watching her husband father children with multiple other women. She's forced to live in close quarters with rival wives and their kids, and she's expected to help parent and financially support children who represent her husband's intimate relationships with other women, while she struggles with her own childlessness. The parenting philosophy conflicts take on a different dimension when you understand that Meri was often the only adult trying to maintain any kind of order or safety standards in chaotic multi-family households. When Christine adopted a kids approach that allowed behavior like jumping on furniture, going through cabinets, and physical roughhousing, someone still had to deal with the practical consequences of that chaos. Think about watching Peyton repeatedly physically intimidate smaller children, while Christine consistently failed to intervene effectively. If you're Meri, you're faced with an impossible choice. Watch vulnerable kids get hurt or step in and face explosive confrontations for overstepping boundaries. Either choice results in conflict and criticism, but only one choice actually protects the children from immediate physical harm. The financial stress adds another crushing layer to Meri's situation. She's not just managing her own household needs. She's contributing to support children and adults in a system where resources are always stretched thin and her own emotional needs are completely ignored. She's expected to be selfless and sweet while watching her husband pour attention and resources into newer relationships that pushed her further into the background. But here's what makes Meri's situation particularly tragic. She couldn't express her frustration or emotional needs without being labeled as jealous, bitter, or failing in her spiritual obligations. The polygamous system demanded that she keep sweet, swallow her pain, and continue functioning as if watching your husband build intimate relationships with other women while you struggle with infertility is perfectly normal and manageable. The different styles of parenting weren't really about household management or discipline philosophies. They were about two women under enormous psychological stress, competing for limited resources and attention, forced to cooperate in child rearing while dealing with their own unresolved trauma and unmet emotional needs. The children became casualties in conflicts that were really about adult survival in an impossible system. Meri's directness with her emotions, her inability to keep sweet and suppress her feelings, actually reveals better mental health compared to adults who successfully buried their authentic responses under layers of religious programming. She was reacting like a human being under intolerable stress, while others learned to numb themselves to survive the system's psychological demands. This doesn't mean the children's trauma isn't real or that harmful behavior toward kids is acceptable, but it does mean that focusing solely on individual personalities misses the larger truth. The polygamous system was designed to create exactly these kinds of conflicts. It pitted women against each other, created impossible parenting situations, and generated trauma for everyone involved while making escape financially and emotionally difficult. The tragedy isn't that Meri was a bad person who chose to hurt children. The tragedy is that an abusive religious system created conditions where psychologically damaged adults were forced to function as parents and caregivers while dealing with their own unprocessed trauma, financial stress, and emotional neglect. Everyone in that system was being harmed, and that harm inevitably flowed downward to the most vulnerable members of the family. And now we get to the most heartbreaking part of this entire mess. Because while the adults were fighting their territorial battles and processing their own trauma, the children were paying a psychological price that's still being calculated decades later. What happened to these kids reveals the true cost of using children as weapons in adult power struggles. And the damage runs so much deeper than anyone wants to admit. The forced integration alone was psychological torture for developing minds. These children were told they were suddenly siblings and expected to bond with strangers who represented their father's betrayal of their original family structure. Imagine being Christine's kids and watching your dad disappear emotionally and physically after Robin joined the family.